This is Green Planet, Blue Planet podcast. I am here today with Marc Barasch. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yeah, I'm excited. You're sitting outside having this conversation with me in this beautiful, lush green backyard. You know, very fitting setting for a conversation about regeneration, the principles of nature, and systemic change that is inspired by the principles of nature. And Marc, you've been on this pursuit for quite a bit, and possibly longer than many others, because you've seen that sustainability is kind of more like a buzzword to try to band-aid systems that were never functional to begin with.
Precisely. I mean, my model really comes from healing. I spent a certain part of my career writing books about healing. I've been a cancer patient. I was inspired by holistic health, models of holistic health, where there are interlocking systems and synergies. You can't just treat symptoms. You have to treat the soil, the terrain. As there was a big divide in medicine back in the 18th century. Is it the terrain of the body that's problematic, or is it the symptomology? And the symptoms fixers won, and of course that was a great breakthrough for science. But in the process, what was lost was the terrain. It's called psychoneuroimmunology, or biopsychosocial medicine. So I think regeneration is sort of like biopsychosocial medicine for the planet.
That's a brilliant metaphor.
Yeah, having had the experience of my own body being sort of laid waste and being like land that had degenerated, I suppose, and then having had the experience of no matter how barren anything is, whether it's a life or a psyche or a body or an environment, it can be regenerated through care, right? And looking at things in a holistic way. And so I was sort of primed for it from that.
From
and
your own
also
path, yeah.
From my own path, yeah. I mean, I'd written a series of books, really on, I guess, the pursuit of the whole, which is how Plato defined love. How do we move from being in parts, partial, fragmented, to being whole, whether that's mind or body or society? And I had done a kind of a trilogy of books on healing and various dimensions, but they were all this sort of holistic model. And then I did a book on compassion called The Compassionate Life as an extension of that. And then from there, I just felt, well, enough, as Goethe said, enough words have been spoken, now let us see some deeds.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I'm just running around talking about important things and things that inspire people, but at what point does it affect actual people who are suffering on the ground?
Let's talk about this, because you founded Green World, right? Which is one of those projects to bring together those who understand the talk and connect with it, but to actually move into the embodiment of it, and in different places across the planet. Because this is kind of the genius thing about regeneration as a movement, right? The principles apply to the biological well-being of the planet and people. So they will apply anywhere, no matter which bioregion we're in, no matter which kind of what kind of symptoms are there left by the old system. Exactly. So where did you guys start?
Well, we started in Ethiopia. I had been looking for something to do, and this was also an experiment in synchronicity, I suppose. I mean, I think there are a lot of layers to reality, and it's good if our work reflects as many of them as possible. So this was sort of asking, to be a little bit trite, maybe, or new agey, what does the universe want? And I ran into a guy who had been doing agroforestry in 2005, which I'd never heard of before. I mean, I'd been, a staunch environmentalist. I'd done global broadcasts for Ted Turner that were radical enough that the sponsors all canceled and they broadcast anyway. I mean, seeing something dire coming, but realizing that it's not enough, as the old environmental movement first did, was sort of wave your arms around and try to, scare people. It's coming. That's not very inspiring. And So I mentioned I had done this book on compassion and I was on a book tour, and somebody came up to me and said, I want to join your movement. I said, well, I don't have a movement, but I'll try to invent something that we could all do that would be compassionate, that would be an expression of compassion.
Right.
Then when I met this guy who had been doing agroforestry, I thought, well, has everything. I mean, it's obviously helping people, it's helping biodiversity, it's regenerating soil, it's providing economic benefits, health benefits. It seems to address all the things that I care about. So he invited me to go to Ethiopia. We went to an area called the Garagi Zone, which was a Muslim area. And I found myself at one point kind of the only white face among 10,000 Muslims who there was a certain radical component that had just burned down their mosque. It was really interesting. And they were growing coleandra trees. And these are very good for soil, but they also have these incredible red blossoms that pollinators prefer. So this was prospering the honey hives in the community. And I just saw, oh, this is how it works. It's people and planet. It's looking at this. Wendell Berry put it very well, the poet. He said, solving for pattern. Or Buckminster Fuller was asked once, how do you solve a problem? And he said, well, you start with the universe. So it was looking at, okay, what is the holon that consists of people and planet, community, and environment, and then how do you solve for that? And they were figuring that out. So it was really kind of an initiatory experience. I wound up with a very severe case of malaria that I nearly died of, and it was kind of an interesting remaking of one's being. It's an initiation, right? When you nearly go and then you return, you're not quite the same. It's the old shamanic model, if you will. So it was a very profound experience on many levels. And then to realize that, of course, we have, as you said, this is global. It's global and it's emergent. Nobody's promulgating any great doctrine necessarily. I mean, the core principles of regeneration are disseminating, but fundamentally, it is the process of emergence, and it's emerging everywhere. And in Ethiopia, I became very aware of that. I was told these are people that think the way I was thinking, and it came out of their indigenous traditions and kind of a return to the old ways. I mean, you mentioned giving up the old models. Obviously, we need to sort of hospice the old and midwife the new at this point, and it has to be a system change, as you say. It has to be a phase shift. But at the same time, that phase shift obviously owes a lot to indigeneity and indigenous traditions. So this is
where it gets so interesting between the concept, right, of the systems change, opposed to just the embodiment of actually changing things that are in integrity with the indigenous way of being. Which at this point, I think many people realize that we're all indigenous to the earth. Because we've lost this, we've allowed ourselves to pretend we're part of the machine world or something. Yeah. But so these moments of action, this is something that, talk about Ethiopia, I think you've planted over 100,000 trees in Ethiopia at this point.
Well, we had, that was where we first worked. I'll fast forward and say, after working in, I think, 9 countries, we wound up in Kenya. And I've been focusing on Kenya mostly for the last 10 years. So we planted 4 million trees there on next to nothing. I should mention this has been a volunteer effort. That was part of the frame. Was my feeling was, I don't want to just be a charity that is, no offense to the great work that charities do, but there's a certain element of kind of dining on the backs of people who are making $2 a day. And having the big offices and it's all good, and far be it from me. But I just felt like, I wonder what would happen if you just start with nothing. I was kind of showing off for my girlfriend at that time, who was asking me, what do you do? I don't understand what you do. And I said, well, watch this space. This is an empty hat, and out of emptiness comes fullness. Something emerges out of intention. And some degree of sincerity, and what the Buddhists call skillful means. I mean, this was sort of me returning to a very early vow I'd taken studying Buddhism in my 20s and with a Tibetan Lama. And he tricked us into taking the Bodhisattva vow, very incautious thing to do. And it haunts you. And it was sort of like, okay, what does that mean? So this was an experiment, and I wonder what will arise if I kind of decide I'm going to devote my life to doing the most good that I can. And I dropped everything. I dropped a pretty good career at the time also, and just wanted to see what would happen. And so we eventually did wind up in Kenya after, practicing, I guess, in a lot of other countries, Philippines also, conflict zones in some cases. And just essentially wound up with no program. Sometimes you shed things as you go along rather than accrue them. And this was shedding preconceptions. Mm-hmm. And by the time we wound up in Kenya, it was basically like, well, what do you need? What do you know? How can we facilitate? Which is really the principle of regeneration anyway. In many ways, it's just adding, if you add a little shade and moisture to what seems to be degraded, barren land, things begin to come up just from that. And sometimes there are things that have been there a long time.
Let's slow down on this example for a second, though, Marc, because what you said is like pure gold right there. We're facilitating the process of regeneration, right? Rather than pretending that we are the ones regenerating everything. I think, which is a big distinction to sustainability as well, is like, we've got these elaborate modern systems. They're great. We just need to add sustainability to them. That's another one of those, reductionist kind of falsities. Yeah. But when we look at regeneration, it's a process that is inherently part of nature, right? And we as the human gardeners or caretakers, and I love that you started this conversation with compassion and care, which are the themes in your books and the core elements of what you teach and share and walk in the world. We really just have to learn to understand different bioregions and what they might need in any given moment of time. So as you said, like if we add some more biomaterial back to the soil now will be a bit more moist. And so the fungi can kick back in, and suddenly nutrients get shared underneath the soil and more things grow again. And suddenly the cycle of life is there without us doing a whole lot.
Yeah, with an inhering intelligence. Right. And, my college roommate was a man named Kenneth Ossable, who started Bioneers. And I think the slogan of Bioneers is something like, it's all connected, it's all relatives, it's all intelligent. And when you, are working in places where traditional cultures are still alive, like we wound up at one point in Imo State in Nigeria, and the Igbo people have two amazing sayings. One is life to all life. It's kind of like biophilia prime, right? And the other is they have this, they call it clever world. It's a kind of an almost mystical concept, but it's at the, it's again, this idea of there's an inhering intelligence, right? How does a seed know how to grow a tree? I mean, we know scientifically, but there's a dimension to it that's, that the level of information contained and the program for growth and thriving that already exists, that needs to be encouraged, just like with people. You can't, it's very hard to change people. It's one of those, the door unlocks from the inside. So a lot of the door for regeneration is unlocking from the material at hand, but Jung called the prima materia, right? The soil, the negrido. And there are certain facilitations that you can do. But, when I look at a lot of the sustainability projects, as you said, which is kind of add-ons, and, all due respect to Jeffrey Sachs, who I've met a number of times, but Millennium Villages were not the answer. I don't know how much was spent on that, $100 million maybe, but you can't sort of figure it out and then air freight it to
there's culture. Something very interesting in us coming back to this comparison between sustainability and regeneration a few times already. And for me, the theme throughout hundreds of podcast episodes has been over and over again, concept versus embodiment, right? Like, of course, some things might make sense in the theory of the mind, but reality isn't reductionist. So we have to actually emancipate over reductionist scientificism and understand that things that are in alignment with or in attunement with the life force that created everything, they will probably be pretty simple. Like for sure, everyone can touch, feel, and smell them, meaning every single person without an expert can touch soil and have an experience with that and understand, is that soil fertile? Is that soil barren? Is that soil being poisoned with Roundup? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something quite simple that we don't even need to have 2 decades of education and schooling for first. I mean, certain elements of that will help, but at the core, being a human being, we are able to connect with that principle of life. It's a lived experience, and we all share it.
Yeah, it's the beginner's mind idea, right? So the old saying, in the expert's mind, there are few possibilities, and the beginner's mind, there are many. So by going into, let's say, Kenya as an example, and how we evolved these programs. I mean, I certainly would not have considered myself particularly expert, but things would arise. So, for example, one of the people that was working with us in tree planting turned out to be someone who had been an elementary school teacher. And I said, well, could we create, some kind of eco courses or club or some way of working with the next generation in the school system? And he sort of came up with this idea of green world clubs, essentially, and he taught kids how to plant seedbed nurseries, started with one school, and was also nutrition for them. It was also a way to introduce kind of multi-purpose species into their farming communities, which had lost a lot of these traditions and were planting almost monocrop maize, et cetera, not the best thing to be planting. And then it sort of caught on. And there was one school that had somebody who painted murals. So all of a sudden the school said Green World and had our logo on the side because the kids were finding that enlivening. That was like the fertilizer, and then it began to sort of affect the whole school. Then the communities started using the school as a community center, an innovation center. And that became part of our model till we had 85 schools now in that area. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of kids have been through these kinds of programs. We didn't build the schools. We looked at what was already there, and we looked at the transformational model. How do you benignly hack into what already exists and potentiate it and see what people want to potentiate. Then it turned out that somebody else knew some of the indigenous elders in these kaya forests, which are the revenants of the great coastal forests of Kenya, which have mostly been cut down. But these survived because they were sacred. And they had custodians in the elders who said, no, this is when we cut this is when you hunt that, or you don't hunt that, this is forbidden, religious rules that were really biocultural models of how to steward an environment. So we began to bring the kids up into the kaya forest because there hadn't been that much contact between them. And the elders were able to sort of transmit this knowledge to them. And the kids were able to help them to restore these kaya forests, which are actually UNESCO heritage sites. And that began to become part of what we did. And that led to a youth movement of kids who adopted a slogan, plant a tree, harvest peace, during one of the contested elections. Beautiful. And were marching in the streets, talking and using some of the indigenous ideas that they had been reacquainted with, that had been somewhat forgotten. And it's sort of the idea that inherent, again, in the world is the medicine, even the old alchemical formulation, and the poison is the medicine. In the chaos and the confusion that we have is some kind of wisdom waiting to be born out of that. And so we found that a lot of things, even though we have obviously thought very hard about this and worked very hard, and as I said earlier, essentially worked on nothing as part of our experiment, in the sense of like, well, how will this even happen if we don't do it the traditional way? What if we don't go to the big foundations, which are constantly asking us for single outcome metrics, when that's a ridiculous concept? A single outcome metric will ruin everything that we're doing. It won't work. It doesn't work. It often, you look at it 10 years later and it's been, someone's gotten paid to dig a hole and someone's gotten paid to fill it back in. That's kind of the essence of sustainability, right? It's not negative entropy. It's not synergy, creating something new. So we just found that, if we just followed the lines of force, if you will, the way you when you're a kid, you put a magnet under something and then you put the iron filings down, and lo and behold, there's a pattern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite fascinating when we follow the patterns of nature and when we, dare to disconnect from those single metric kind of ways to look at anything. And I know for a lot of people in our personal lives, this is a process that is happening. For some people, it already has happened. For some people, it has happened like for you, decades ago with so much commitment. But I want to hook in one more time here. Like when that moment happened, where you're like, I got to leave this current career, and I'm going to commit myself to regeneration, because not just do I believe I'm right, I can feel that this is actually what life is calling me for. This is a quite courageous step, right?
Well,
right?
I never had a normal career, so I was lucky. I was thinking about this, like a lot of people I've found that I've talked to, you kind of have an intimation when you're a kid. And I just always felt like I'm going to find a path in life that will, be, I don't want to sound pious here, it sounds ridiculous, but to be of service, that I sensed that there was a crisis when I was quite young and that was coming. And I did my best to respond to it. So, I spent my 20s studying Buddhism, basically. And my first job after dropping out of Yale was washing dishes. And I did that for a good while. They actually had to fire me to get me out of it because they said, you could do more.
You wouldn't have left. You become Buddhist all the way.
Well, it
finding
became
the true happiness in washing dishes.
Yeah, it was a path in a way. And I did a lot of other things like that and wound up doing magazines and New Age Journal back in the day and that sort of thing. So everything, and I'm not going to give a long, boring resume, but basically those lines of force seemed to be pretty visible for me. So it was sort of groping around, trying to be additive in any way that I knew, and basically, to be honest, spending long periods of time not doing, an old Buddhist trick. A lot comes out of not doing.
I do believe that if we want to achieve great things and do big things, then we have to do a whole lot of nothing in between, so that there's a balance with it, right? Because the push hustle culture, at my generation, it just results in burnout. I don't know anyone from back in the school days that hasn't, now that they're my friends are all in their 30s, like I am. My friends from those days, who hasn't, to some degree or other, experienced that if they just keep running, that's what it's going to result into. So we already know that, from lived experiences, like this cannot be the path forward. And you already summarized a few of the clarities, right? One is kind of the theme we're meeting on in this podcast. It's really not about adding sustainability measures to something. It's about understanding the core principle, which is regeneration. The second one I heard you say has to do with, I would say, reclaiming our indigeneity, or understanding that there are still indigenous wisdom holders that are living according to some of the principles that humans have learned for thousands of years to live in symbiosis with the ancient forests.
Which is agroecology, the oldest form of food production, of course.
Yeah, right? Agroecology. And so on the path forward, Marc, what are some ways how we can take these two, learnings of regeneration, agroecology, into, I personally don't even like saying fighting climate change. I think that's a totally inhibited narrative. For me, it's just about a thriving planet, And so what does it take? Like, how do we learn from these mistakes from the past and come into this balance individually, but also, collectively? Because it still seems like there's massive counter forces operating. I don't know anyone whose head isn't spinning in a paradox about all of this.
It is a moment of confusion for sure. And out of that evolved something else, right? Which we're in the midst of. We can't see it. Yeah. But I think, it's in a sense, we're asking, what is our civilization for? Different civilizations have had a sense of a mission, whatever it was, sometimes benevolent, sometimes not so benevolent. And of course, the West has become, to some extent, consumers, right? It's like, here's your life. It's handed to you. This is what you're to do. And there are very few, for example, examples of any of what is a regenerative enterprise. What is an enterprise that actually, by its operations, is regenerating communities and landscapes, and people are getting paid for it, right? Because I'm not advocating, complete voluntarism, it's not going to work. People have to be able to make a living. So we're looking, it's kind of like you start looking at one thread in the sweater and you see like all the threads are connected, and you almost have to make a new sweater, or you have to find out which threads in that sweater are can be it's a bad analogy, but can somehow be fortified, and capitalized on in the best sense. And we don't know what that is yet. I mean, we are now, having been, kind of small, but with, I must say, some grandiose ideas of regreening the world. It's taken a little longer than I thought. I mean, I started this 16 years ago, and the slogan was regreen the world in one generation, because it seemed to me, if we didn't draw down carbon into the 5 billion acres of degraded land that had just been discovered around that time that I started, I was working with the UN Forum on Forest Secretariat, and they just recalculated the amount of degraded land from about 2 billion acres to 5 billion. And John Holdren was a science advisor to the Obama White House, and was saying, well, the way to do that is trees, restoring degraded land, vegetation, and you can draw down carbon. This is before drawdown was even the vocabulary. And, that is something we have still yet to really tackle, to say that there are, I suppose direct air capture may someday be a viable technology, but not to sound like a Luddite technology will be part of it. But I think that we have this opportunity staring us in the face of regenerating vast tracts of degraded land. So that would employ a lot of people, certainly the developing world, where you have these massive youth populations, right? And the one thing the government fears most in any of these countries is youth unemployment, because they can be radicalized. And do reforestation, afforestation, conversion to agroecology, to create nutrient-dense food that way, on and on and on. We're doing it more in the US. There are possibly hundreds of billions starting to pour into so-called regenerative agriculture, climate-smart agriculture. But I think what's being neglected, and where I had decided fairly arbitrarily to plant myself, literally and figuratively, was in the developing world, because all across the tropical belt there is this degraded land. And in alchemy, in the Bible, it says the philosopher's stone, the pearl of great price, is the stone the builders cast aside. The throwaway land, throwaway people that are just marginalized, lands that's marginalized. That might be our salvation. So we are, I'll mention that, I mentioned in passing that we sort of evolved in a very organic way this idea of the regenerative society. So not just regenerative agriculture, not just regenerative this or that, but what is a society that functions in a regenerative way? And that's kind of caught on in coastal Kenya. And really just 2 weeks ago, again, out of nowhere, somebody called me, and we had a 5-hour conversation, a woman in Kenya, who works with a new public-private consortium in coastal Kenya that is 6 counties, which are states, essentially, 4 of which we work in. And out of that has evolved the possibility that I can't talk too much about because it's nascent, but for demonstrating the viability of the regenerative society model in a development plan that could be actually quite well funded. So it would be going from having spent a lot of time pretty close to the ground and simply trying to do things with the most authenticity that we could, as effectively as we could, and to learn. That may now be magnified by powers of 10 as things happen, right? It's like homeopathy. A little dose sometimes can cure the body. So I think that we are all of us, right, very conscious of scale, right, capitalization, how essential it is for trillions of dollars to be ported from the degenerative economy to the regenerative economy within 5 to 10 years. Some would say 5. I would say 5.
Well, this brings us to such an interesting point in the conversation, though, right? Like, I'm with you. In theory, conceptually thinking, we need to pour money from the degenerative society, the destructive society that, we've talked about this in other episodes quite a bit, like that's based on extraction, destruction, and death, basically, death of the soil, death of animals. Right? There's this whole reality to it that we don't want to digress in today, but
very good. Did you just formulate that just now? Extraction, distraction, and death?
Yeah,
That's
no, I
that's
mean
that's good.
it's very visible, right? It's very visible
Yeah,
at,
the
at this point.
distraction part being very important to
Yeah, and 10
the
years
extraction
ago,
part. Yeah,
yeah, 10 years ago, I would have probably naively said, oh no, these are all just people trying their best. And there's probably many people trying their best in big institutions, but there is still like a force that's actually really destroying the planet. And so the people that are, building something else, I think we're also realizing money itself is one of the crux kind of points here. It's one of those bridges that if we have different economic sense making, if we are able to bank the way the forest banks, right? Maybe this change can happen even way quicker. Maybe the old power players are going to have to shuffle a little bit and move into a different and new power structure. And, technologically speaking, I mean, I think everyone who's heard about the blockchain and the ledger technology is hoping that it can turn into that tool for us. What's your point of view on that? Yeah.
It's a very complex question right now.
Yeah.
So a lot of good intentions become kind of a Mobius strip. You think of 12 Gnostic Jews sitting around having a Seder in the first century, at the beginning of the first century. And next thing you know, it's the Holy Roman Empire. A lot of things, are sucked up by the existing systems, so we make systems and systems make us. And how to hack that in a way that's enduring and is generally a genuine transformative departure, right? That actually affects transformation and doesn't just put old wine in new bottles is a challenge throughout history. And we're seeing in the blockchain world what that turned into, I'm sorry, but a lot of FOMO and greed and envy and all, and pyramidal fortunes being built, and eventually being to some extent a tool of finance capital. Exactly what everybody said they were getting away from, right? So that happens all the time.
That first bubble definitely happened exactly as you just said, and that bubble is bursting continuously, but the technology underneath it still holds the promise, no?
It could. I mean, if we can solve, obviously, carbon emissions, and if we really do go to proof of stake, and if that works, and there are a lot of ifs, right? I mean, there are a lot of, Sweden, for example, I think came, down hard on the blockchain industry, not for the usual reasons, but because they were using all the renewable energy to generate money, essentially, right? And the Swedish government felt, hey, we're trying to build a regenerative economy here to actually do goods and services, and all the power is going to computational operations, right, for blockchain. So it's very early days how this will genuinely play out. I mean, we are engaged with that. We have a grant from Chainlink Labs, and that came very serendipitously, and we created a proposal for something called the AIRS project, Automated Incentives for Regenerative Stewardship, that we're regarding as a grand experiment, and a small experiment at the moment, in what people are starting to call refi, right? So can there be regenerative finance? Can that work? Can we really figure out those mechanisms? We're looking at it at the moment as just trying to generate superior monitoring and evaluation, so that we really know, for example, if people are talking about carbon in the soil, there's a lot of, I'm sorry to say, a lot of bogusness about that, right? About, well, how deep does the carbon go? Is it below 20 centimeters? Are you really creating soil organic matter? Or is it really meeting the criteria of additionality and permanence? Or is it just a bit of a shock, that, and using a glamorous sounding technology to augment that, because there is a kind of a shortage, really, of carbon credits, right? So, for example, Indigo Agriculture, I think made some announcement the last couple of days that they're selling carbon at $40 a ton now. They were buying it for 15, and it was once as low as 5. So there's kind of a rush for projects, right? I mean, a lot of people are trying to put the info layer, right, the new fintech on top of whatever's happening on the ground. We've taken the point of view we want to generate and regenerate everything from the ground up, not from the not from the top down. So we are, if anything, kind of vertically integrated to an extent right now, but it's all based on what is truthfully happening on the ground. And how do we really measure that in an honest way? And how do we make sure that we're building wealth in communities, not just replicating an extractive model, the way I'm afraid a lot of charities might do, and say, well, hey, you're making more, your daily wage has gone up from $2 to $3. So, job done. No, I mean, this is really returning power and the wealth that people inherently own and back to the people that are creating it. And I think that the idea of regenerating degraded land in particular is interesting because nobody wants it, right? It's like if it's not, it doesn't have a lot of value, but it could have a lot of value. It could be that becomes part of the basis that we all talk about of, could there be a money based on the ultimate store value, which is the well-being of and thriving of people and planet, of landscapes and communities. Right. How do we instantiate that? How does that become a technology that can't be kind of rapidly sucked up into the existing system? Because that Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and everybody else are all over this now. And the whales own, what's the percentage these days of the crypto world? 40 to 50%, right? So it's turned into something different than it started with. And we have to start asking ourselves, okay, what does real community mean? Not just we think a Shiba Inu dog is cute, and maybe if we all jump into the pool at the same time, the early adopters and the middle adopters will get rich. That obviously, that dream is dead right now. And it wasn't a very good dream in the first place, because it was just replicating the existing system. Right, in a lot of ways. So how do we do something? I'm just blabbering on here, but I think the question we're up against is, how do we do something genuinely new that actually does foster health and well-being?
And that's why I wanted to let you talk a little bit here, because I think it's also important to really note a few things. For one is, we still don't really know, but we understand that at the current rate of how things are working, everything, as you said a few times, gets sucked up in this kind of old way of doing things through geopolitical power, through financial oligarchical power. Like it's these constructs, as uncomfortable they make us to look at them and to really kind of unidentify from maybe our formerly perceived identities, and then realize, okay, but who are we as a species without being American or being German or being capitalist or being this or that? Like, these labels, when we let them go and rest for a bit, I think fascinatingly in my life, it just always brings me back to a very simple understanding that I've in my journey of traveling a lot, I've met everywhere in the world, in every human being. Once you're able to connect without connecting through money, identity, through sports or nationality, when you have your hands on the soil, for example, there is a clear remembering, I'm a human being. I'm here in symbiosis with the earth. And that's why I said, when we learn how to bank like the forest does, I believe that the biological world is already showing it to us. But our reductionist way of conceptualizing, or our belief in Cartesian, Darwinian philosophies that might or might not be entirely true, they limit us to rediscover the simplicity that the biology already shows us. Like everything is in a very complex chaos, or in a very beautiful order, is not competing, but working together in an exchange and an interplay, right?
Yeah, and there is co-opetition as well, right? I was just talking to someone this morning about deception, one of the things we've all experienced in our lives, right? And advertising, I think, but nature does that too, right? The flower imitates the female of a certain pollinator species in order to attract the pollinators, right? They're fooling them. There are a lot of things in nature that are, not as we know, hearts and flowers. It's a very complex system that involves competition as well as cooperation, and we are obliged to take the whole thing into account. We can't pretend it's otherwise. And so, again, how does the new thing that regeneration represents, the old thing that it represents, not become a sort of another version of sustainability, which is, here's the window dressing of regeneration, right? Here is essentially finance capital gussied up and dressed up in a different way. And the enabling mechanism, we start with enabling mechanisms, and then it becomes the myth of Frankenstein, right? It's to enable the good that we want to do. Next thing we know, it's actually creating something quite different. And we're, so I'm not being pessimistic. I think we're evolving toward something that basically, let's look at it teleologically, and this kind of reverse engineering. It has to work. Somewhere in the relatively near future, we have figured this out. Because if we haven't, we're fairly cooked. I don't think it's human extinction. I don't go that far, but it's not going to be a very viable civilization. We're already seeing that, even to sociologically.
So, Marc, at that point, I'm going to want to ask you about, your dream for the Earth, your dream for the planet, your dream for the next 7 generations ahead of us. Like, what world do you see we can leave for those generations following us?
Well, I think ironically, not so ironically, I don't think we've ever been at this juncture before. I think there have been seemingly apocalyptic moments. There have been millenarian movements that say we're about, but now it's real. We have never been able to commit ecocide in the history. Human beings have never been able to do it. We can't. And so it's obviously we need to think about 7 generations, but I find myself thinking more about, again, 5 to 10 years. And for myself, 5. I just feel that we need to greatly accelerate in an extremely bold way and figure out how to do it and assume it can be done. The marshaling of people of goodwill and a consciousness of this that I think constitutes an emergent civilization of probably at least 1 billion people. I think a lot of people, you've traveled a lot, and I'm sure you found this everywhere. People have come to very similar realizations, maybe without a lot of input from, the regenerative movement or whatever. It's just something that's arisen in their lives and their environment and their minds. And I'm looking for ways that we can self-aggregate and actually, sort of admit to ourselves that we're part of this emergent civilization. And we're not dispensing with the existing one. It has to be transformational. Revolutions generally don't work out all that well because you kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, I'm not discounting that central banks could have a role. You look at Delton Chen's proposal, which I'm starting to look into more deeply. It involves central banking systems. It involves some kind of hybridization. To simply declare that in a libertarian sort of way, we're all banks now, we have these coins. It's going to be, we're going to have to look at the ground from which all this is springing, which is, again, a mixed bag, but be sort of pragmatic about it. So what do we want to leave? Well, obviously, we want to leave utopia. I think that there was a group when I was going to college called the Living Theater. They were an experimental theater group, and one of the pieces that they did was called Paradise Now. And you have people. I'm forgetting his name, but there's a Yale School of Forestry guy, I think, who says we have to transform the world into a food-producing paradise, right? Through agroecology, but if you look at the recent experiment in Sri Lanka of an almost immediate overnight shift to organic agriculture, it was a devastating failure. Not just because organic agriculture can't scale. There are a lot of other reasons, balance of trade payments, all the rest of it, why that has failed. But everybody knows, including the Sri Lankans, that it's failed. So one of the things they didn't do was integrate and look at how this could be done more gradually, more, with a really well worked out plan. We are hoping, frankly, to create a model of the regenerative society in coastal Kenya that can spread throughout Kenya and through Kenya to the rest of the continent. So that is a more maybe grandiose idea than we've had in the years that we've been working there, just trying to keep going and develop these ideas. But I'm sort of advocating, I guess grandiosity is the wrong term, but to think grandly.
Well, you got to definitely dream big.
Dream big, go big or go home.
I
mean, there's nothing to, no point being full, and no false humility is not going to be very useful.
Right. But then there's also this point where we want to really become, transparently mature around who are key players with which interests. Like when you speak about central banks, for example, for me personally, all the alarm flags go off, because this is one of the things that usually disempowers, let's say, smaller regions like Kenya and coastal Kenya.
And I'm not holding to that. I mean, we devised, I think, probably the first viable community ecocurrency, which was just a paper voucher system, and it works beautifully, and we think it can scale. But let's not, central bank is a little bit, I agree. I'm just saying that there is a banking system. It exists. There's no way to pretend it doesn't exist. And I'm not convinced we can replace it overnight. So there's going to have to be some kind of dialogue.
It's like a overnight success, 10 years in the making. It will take time, and it will take many experiments. Marc, I'm so glad you made the time, and that you are co-founder, co-initiator, and just in the path of running some of those experiments, running some of those projects, and empowering people, encouraging them to do that in their local bioregion, just like in coastal Kenya or in other projects we talked about, like Ethiopia, and there's Mexico and India on the map of Green World, and so keep doing what you're doing, and let's share the learnings, and let's see where the fruit really starts to show up, because I believe we still don't really know. As you said, we know we have to, and we know that there's a complex system that is currently still distracting and destroying. Some of those players who are running that old system might have to move out of the power equation.
Yes.
But I personally believe only the people and the power of the people in their bioregions are able to really carry it, because that's who's going to do it in the end anyway.
Yeah, so we've been operating on that assumption.
See that.
The idea of working with banks is sort of a new concept. I was just up at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and people were bringing up Delton Chen's work. I haven't looked into it deeply enough, but I would say this: we have kind of built a utopian experiment in coastal Kenya, but it needs to scale. And I can tell you, frankly, I don't know where that capital is going to come from. I mean, I would love to think it will come from, maybe philanthropy. Maybe people aren't interested in ownership and a vested interest. It may, but it's not easy to scale that way either. And that system has its own flaws. So, I mean, can DeFi, refi, DAOs, I mean, will that do it? We don't know. Right. I just think we have to look at everything and look at.
But there's something really interesting what you just said. Just I'm gonna take that extra minute as we're wrapping the episode. But the notion of scale. Now I understand it from the perspective of like we are a big planet, or a small planet in the context of the Milky Way and the universe around us. But we are a pretty big planet, and so there's humans doing things all over the place. So we can't bring the whole ecosystem into balance just by doing something in Kenya. Now that makes sense to me. But the notion of scale in my mind goes back to associations I would have learned in economy classes in university back in Germany, which are very much the old system.
It's a dirty word in regeneration. And maybe
but at the same time,
right
scale might mean something new in regeneration, something we don't even know how to define yet, which is that the model you made in Kenya is so holistically decentralized, really just works for that bioregion, that another bioregion can copy it, but they can be so inspired by that this bioregion Kenya or coastal Kenya has figured something out, that is the new idea of scale. Like, I don't know, I'm just, kind of throwing it in the mix here.
I think replication and scale are correctly attributed to the old system, and in a way don't have a place in discussions of regeneration where everything is local, everything is specific, but you're dealing with certain, I don't even want to say algorithms, but certain principles, right? Maybe the only principle we have is whatever that we trusted the generative capacity of the landscape and the communities to tell us what to do. And maybe that's the only thing that's, one of the only things that's transferable, along with certain basic practices. But we don't know, as we're saying. I mean, most of us, we believe agroecology could feed the world. We think that agribusiness is, it's propaganda to some extent, right? The Green Revolution is petering out. It's had a lot of bad side effects, on and on. But I don't know for a fact. I don't think anybody does and could say, okay, we can make this mass conversion back to that system. And that is going to save us.
Well, we will have to try. But the cool thing that we're landing on here is that not knowing means we'll have to do it with beginner's mind, which then outrules to make the same mistakes again because someone argues with strong lawyers and lots of capital for the existing systems. It's like, well, that's not beginner's mind at all, right? Yeah. So the beginner's mind is, I think, a very important part of the equation. I'll meet you there, Marc. Like, I don't know. I really don't know, but I'm committed to listen and record and broadcast about it.
Yeah, which is wonderful. I mean, we know that the agro-industrial system has failed in a million ways. The military-industrial system, the medical industrial system, they have. And so it's a shell of something. It's sort of the dinosaur phase, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe the hungry caterpillar phase that turns into the butterfly, right?
Thank you so much, Marc, for taking the time, for sharing your wisdom, for sharing some of your experiences, and for, just walking the walk you do in the world.
Thank you for taking the time with me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk more maybe another time. Yeah,
we'll wrap the recording here, but that was awesome. Let's definitely stay connected, and you enjoy the beautiful afternoon that I can still see in your backyard happening.
Yeah, I would actually, I feel like we were just getting started, actually.
Yeah.
And I would like to continue this conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to make conversations like this on almost like a round table format, where we have 3 or 4 people come together and go longer, so that because as you said, we're meeting in the beginning, and then you start seeing, okay, this is where, because we're all.
I mean, that whole conversation. I mean, I probably shouldn't have brought up central banks. It's just been on my mind.
I love that you did.
As a conundrum, because they exist.
Look,
but it isn't certainly the thing I want to be putting across.
No, but you're so right. Like we can pretend that certain things don't exist. I never used to talk about geopolitical power players in the first days of recording these podcasts, but I've gone to meetings like Davos and other meetings, and it's excuse my French, but it's just a whole bunch of BS. When people conceptually sit in rooms to make choices about how they can make more money, it's like, maybe some people have good intentions, je ne sais quoi, I don't know. What I'm noticing is that the person who in coastal Kenya needs to eat from the soil that is on their earth there, that's never going to connect, it's never going to. So that person ideally takes care of themselves and their community. And so that's where, for me, it started spinning.
Well, inherently, it's extracted, right?
Yeah,
what they say.
Yeah. You can't pretend that someone master planning like a game plan might have very negative consequences.
But I'll tell you that we were, before COVID struck, I was creating. I did the. I don't know if you know about Regen 18. It was.
I saw it. I read.
So you're right. So I partnered with the people that founded SOCAP, who were really coming from a different place than I was, by the way. And it was, that led to, and it was successful. As 500 people there that I think really needed to talk to each other. But then I thought, well, how do we do this? How can we do an alternative to Davos, which is nonetheless bringing in people who have a certain degree of power and influence and understanding of the system, that want to make a change and see if it's even possible. How could we have that level of dialogue? And we actually had reserved a place called Co-Palace in Switzerland, outside of Geneva.
Oh, cool.
And we were starting to invite people, and COVID struck, we couldn't do it. But I think we need those kinds of gatherings that are not just our tribe, but the other tribes too. I mean, and it may be that they're beyond redemption. The system is beyond redemption. I mean, I tend to agree with you on that. I mean, the pregogene, like dissipative structures.
and this is where it's paradoxical to talk about it, because I say this now because I'm becoming aware of the responsibility of broadcasting, is that it needs to be said that these systems are beyond recovery. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't all be meeting and have more meetings with more people, so that more of us are in these conversations and dialogues and finding different solutions for different bioregions. Like, that is probably how the process will happen. So it's paradoxical in that sense, because since I don't know, I just believe that, as you said, we will get there this way or that way at some point.
Yeah, I think that's at the, when you look at religion, they have eschatology, right? It's sort of like I don't know, Buddhist, obviously, but the Christians have this idea, Jesus has already returned, and so we're in the future, and we're experiencing the emanations of that return. That's their theology. I think that there are emanations from the future in a way, right? Like, we have solved this someplace in the three times that comprise our collective, our consciousness. I feel that,
yeah. I mean, time is
and we don't know how we did it, but we have to assume, and if we can pick up on that, we might get some clues.
And this is where when I hear you say that, what comes up for me is we can only solve it if the people that are currently in power positions are not the most powerful people anymore. I'm totally with you what you said in the episode earlier. Like, that doesn't mean we're going to make a revolution and like need to bloody kill them. That would be, pretty nonsensical. But the oligarchical and the geopolitical power construct is becoming so obviously not just unethically a problem, but it's becoming so obviously a path to a destructive future.
It's paradigmatically locked in a certain way.
It's just locked into that direction.
Yeah.
And so, since that's not going to benefit most of the people anyway, and plus it's locked into that direction, it's like, well, maybe it's just time to really put that aside. And now, again, the transition is going to be a big question mark. But the goal, we know, is that no matter if you live in California, in Canada, in Brazil, where I do go a lot, in Kenya, you're going to experience a thriving local community, a thriving bioregion. Very, very, very likely, all of these bioregions talk to each other. But so the path has to likely be both like top down and up, like bottom up, because if your coastal Kenyan community isn't taking care of itself, and we might or might not see this in the next year or two, is like they could just get locked out of the global food system. Well, good luck then. You're all going to die.
No question. I mean, we're doing something called the Moringa moonshot, which could replace 15% of the wheat imports to Africa, right? But here's the thing I want to mention. I mean, I don't know if you have time. I'm keeping you from lunch.
I got to make lunch, but I mean, I got a client in 30 minutes. But,
okay. I mean,
tell me the example.
The conversation. So, the example is that that began with just having learned about moringa trees and my malarial fugue state in Ethiopia, and thinking, oh my God, what an amazing tree. I never heard of that. So I brought it. I kind of emphasized it in some of our
moringa. Yeah, it's the best.
Moringa, the best. But moringa could regenerate degraded land all over the world, all over the tropical belt. It's a major. It's not a specialty smoothie powder, right? It could be an important keystone species in agroecological systems.
In Brazil, they talk about this just the same way. I just spent time on an agroforestry project, 8 years in the making, and same moringa. It's like they're king,
So the example is, so we've been doing it, again, this has all been homemade, and believe me, I've been a permanent exile from any system that I can think of. So I've just avoided, my policy is, what you're saying, just build our own. just make the new thing. Don't think about the old thing. And I've done that up until now. But the way I also observe the way things emerge, it's the process of emergence, right? So what is emerging organically are interfaces with much larger institutions that I've avoided all along. I haven't even related to major charities. It's just like, fuck it, we'll work for nothing. Then you can't control us because you're not paying us, right?
No,
it's a great freedom in that, but you don't get as much done. And so the Moringa Moonshot is now Rutgers, UC Davis. Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I've found all the people, these people kind of sequestered within these places, these systems, who are good people, who are brilliant innovators in moringa and horticulture, who get the whole model, but they're in these systems that are interfacing. Look, UC Davis with Gates, with agribusiness, with all the big bad guys. That's part. Now my guy there, not so much, but he's part of that system. The guy at Rutgers, part of a university system, which is in phase lock with the various industrial systems that we abhor and the financial systems. However, they can do things. They can do things at a different scale, and I think I've picked the people who are not going to screw it up, who actually see the world. I vet things very carefully, right? For years. This has been 5 or 6 years with these people. I think they will be able to aggregate some of the resources needed to do that. The Regenerative Society project, right? It's still very small. It's been very small for 10 years that we've been doing it. It's grown, it's developed, it's become a model that we can talk about, maybe propagate. However, because of this synchronicity, whatever you want to call it, I have now, and this is confidential, if you don't mind, but we're now in a very deep conversation with a large consortium that is a coastal development consortium, public-private partnerships. It's everybody. So it's industry, it's culture, it's Swahili culture, it's agriculture, it's the government, which we have avoided like the plague. I've had nothing to do with any government for this project deliberately. Like, no, don't want your money, don't want the camel get his nose under the tent. I've liked not having money in one way, no mafia, no corrupt officials show up, nobody's able to strong arm us, and nothing for them to steal. That's great, but we haven't scaled. And let's not use the term scale. Let's say natural growth, but whatever has to happen to make this phase shift, that
would be an interesting one to define the word scale in new ways. But I hear you. The thing is that at the end of the day, everywhere there are going to be really good people as well in all of the organizations, entities, even in the governments. But the power grip systematically and through our legal systems and through the capital that funds the legal systems.
Well, look at America. Right.
America is a prime example, right? But the whole world, it really operates like this at this point. That power grip is still a challenge. And so one of the last really exciting interviews, they're all exciting for me, but exciting in terms of something new has been with Earth Equity, who makes sure that the natural world has a legal representation in any signed deal ultimately. Because imagine in your whatever deal you're going to sign with whatever players, there's also like a legal right for the river, the mountain, and the tree that can be defended in court by a independent for the entity of the river, mountain, or tree. So they basically need to gain personhood to have that legal right in court. And I don't know how that would be in Kenya, but then these are little steps forward to make sure that no matter what could also go sideways in the future, can continue to stay in integrity, continue to be in attunement and alignment, because the natural world can actually beat our legal and our money world, right? And currently it's just impossible for the natural world to beat the capital world. That also needs to change. And so that might, as you say,
it's kind of the eight kinds of capital, need to be the normal model, of course, right?
And that might very well include that in the future, of course, we will have forms of governments and forms of banks. I have no idea how that's going to pan out. So no one's our enemy. We just got to really, really, really understand who are the players and what are their, visible and invisible intentions.
Yeah. Well, I'm going into the heart of darkness in a certain way. I think I found people that are compatible, but it's new. It's just this is a 2-week-old conversation, again, strictly
very
between
exciting.
us.
Yeah.
But it is all the players, and it is 6 states of coastal Kenya. It will inevitably affect the whole country. Kenya, exactly. In turn, is the linchpin of finance. It's the financial center. It's the tech center. Nairobi is the Geneva of Africa, and they are certainly one of the leaders, and not the leaders in a new 21-nation common market. But it's a free market economy, right? So these are all things that the worm is in the apple already. And to be honest, sometimes I think, well, 5 years, can we get 5 years of relatively uncorrupt activity?
That would be
we could just get that much with the assumption that it's been very hard to keep it from going south when you're dealing with a fallen world, if you will, but we need
the phoenix out of the ashes. We need to make moves now, and so it sounds like you're part of a move now that, as you said, it will. And this is another delusion that we all hold in our humanness, like everything that's good is going to also do something wrong. We have to stop pretending that there's only going to be silver bullets that solve all the problems. It's like, no. So if there's massive steps forward and a little bit of steps sideways, that still is really good,
Yeah. So I think that is really, getting out the basic regenerative paradigm is incredibly critical, because it isn't out yet, really. Most people are still not. And you're doing something incredibly important, just doing that, trying to
thank you.
Refine it, and help.
I don't know where you're going to be next year in March, April, but I am going to host a regenerative summit, or like a mastermind summit in Brazil at Terra Buma, this regenerative project I told you about. I have Celine Cousteau already confirmed to come. One of my former interview guests. Let's stay in touch about that. I don't have the website and everything ready, but basically, I think one of the things I feel like responsible for with the broadcasting part is that, look, what if I can bring 30 people like you, myself, and Celine together in Brazil on a place that's already doing it in a very, very important bioregion for Brazil, very close to the Amazon. That's another part of like a Davos, it's like that's a conspiracy in itself. We'll all be breathing together. So, but I think it's going to be very important to do that in natural places where it sounds like you're doing in Kenya. It would be another place where to host something like that, where it's already like, just by being there for a week, your whole body will remember that it's possible.
Yeah. It's sort of like the, an old lefty. So it's like the International. It started, then people began to link up, and that was kind of a labor movement, right? But it has a lot of power when you start to do that. And I would say absolutely. But I think that you got to go.